Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty heavy, actually. It's a recent news story about a plane collision and all the political fallout that followed.
Yeah, definitely a tough one. But it's important to unpack these things, see how a single event can become this like lightning rod for bigger issues.
Exactly. And we've got some interesting sources to help us do that. We'll be looking at a CNN article that lays out the facts of what happened, and then we'll dig into an opinion piece from Daily Kos called Dirt Farming in the South by Southwest Wing of the White House.
Ooh, that title definitely grabs your attention.
Right, and what really caught my eye was former President Trump's response. He's linking this crash to DEI initiatives,
Yeah.
which is interesting considering his own administration seemed to support similar policies.
It is fascinating to see how anxieties around identity politics get stirred up in these situations, It's
Yeah.
almost like a predictable pattern now.
Yeah, so let's get into the specifics. The CNN article reports a horrific collision between an American Airlines jet and a military helicopter. 67 fatalities, it says. And this all happened just as a new presidential administration was finding its feet.
Ah, so the timing is crucial here. A new administration is always a bit shaky in those early days, and then a crisis of this magnitude hits. It's like a trial by fire.
And that's where Trump's statement comes in, right? He goes public blaming the Federal Aviation Administration's diversity push, specifically policies from the Biden and Obama administrations. But, and here's the kicker, he doesn't offer any concrete evidence to back up his claim.
That lack of evidence is a pretty big deal, don't you think? Makes you wonder what his real motivation is.
He hit the nail on the head.
Hmm.
And that's something the Daily Kos piece really digs into. They suggest that Trump might be using this tragedy to deflect blame and, stir the pot a little. You know how he does.
Create some chaos. He does seem to have a knack for that.
The author Anielli even compares it to how he dealt with the 2020 pandemic, using these moments of crisis to push a specific agenda.
It's like a recurring theme in his playbook, almost like clockwork.
And speaking of agendas, the Daily Kos article points out something pretty ironic. Remember, Trump's own administration issued the FAA's Aviation Safety Workforce Plan just a few years back. And that plan specifically encouraged hiring people with disabilities.
Oh, wow. So that directly contradicts his current stance.
Exactly. So on one hand, you have his administration promoting inclusion in aviation, and on the other, he's using diversity as a scapegoat for this horrific accident. It makes you wonder if he's genuinely concerned about safety or if there's a deeper political game at play.
Right. Is this about safety or is this about strategy? Tough to say for sure, but it's a question worth asking.
Definitely. And we see this kind of thing happening in other areas too. Like, remember Elon Musk's reaction to the California wildfires? He put the blame on DEI initiatives within the Los Angeles Fire Department,
Yeah.
again, without providing any real evidence.
It's almost like there's this trend now attributing these complex events to diversity efforts, regardless of the facts.
And the Daily Kos article includes some tweets that capture this sentiment perfectly. They're super critical of Trump's response and how this kind of rhetoric is just amplifying anxieties about identity politics.
Yeah, those tweets are a good reminder that this isn't just some abstract debate happening in the political sphere.
Yeah.
It's affecting real people, shaping how they see the world and each other.
So before we get too deep into that, maybe we should pause for a second and define some terms. For anyone listening who might not be familiar with the term, could you explain what DEI actually means?
Of course, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Basically, it's a framework for creating more welcoming and equitable environments. It's about recognizing and valuing all the different perspectives and experiences people bring to the table.
So it's acknowledging that everyone deserves a place regardless of their background, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, all of it.
Exactly. It's about understanding that our differences make us stronger, not weaker.
So how does this concept of DEI, which seems like a good thing on the surface, become something that people are using as a scapegoat for problems?
Well, it all comes down to implementation and the narratives that surround it. Sometimes DEI initiatives get misconstrued. People see them as prioritizing certain groups over others or undermining meritocracy, and those anxieties can be easily exploited for political gain. And that's the really dangerous thing about these oversimplified narratives. Instead of having real nuanced conversations about DEI and how to make it work, address legitimate concerns, we just end up in this blame game, this back and forth. It's exhausting.
It really is. And it seems like it's happening more and more these days. Like, we're always looking for someone to blame when something goes wrong instead of trying to actually understand the complexity of this situation.
Yeah, and it can really stifle progress. If everyone's worried about being labeled as woke or whatever, it discourages people from speaking out about real injustices or advocating for change.
So how do we break out of this cycle? The Daily Kos authors suggest that Trump's comments are part of a larger strategy to deflect blame and create division. But how do we as individuals navigate this kind of rhetoric?
Hmm.
How do we avoid getting sucked in?
Well, the first step is recognizing the tactics being used. When you hear someone making these broad generalizations about a group or placing blame without any evidence, you got to ask yourself, what's the real agenda here? Are they appealing to my emotions or to my logic?
So be critical of the information we're taking in. Don't just accept everything at face value.
Exactly. And be open to challenging your own assumptions, too. We all have biases. It's just human nature, but we need to be aware of them so they don't cloud our judgment.
That makes sense. But it's still so easy to get caught up in the emotion of it all, you know, especially when these topics are so sensitive.
I get it.
Hmm.
It's not easy to stay objective when you feel like your values are being attacked. But remember, real progress requires understanding, empathy, and being willing to have those tough conversations.
Yeah, if we just retreat to our own sides and yell at each other, nothing's going to change.
Exactly. We need to find ways to connect, to create a space where people feel safe expressing their concerns and working towards solutions together.
And the Daily Cost piece definitely doesn't shy away from expressing their concerns. They argue that Trump's comments aren't just irresponsible, but dangerous. They contribute to this climate of fear and mistrust.
And I think they have a point. Words carry weight, especially when they come from someone in a position of authority. When that power is used to spread misinformation or sow division, it has a ripple effect across society.
The article also highlights those tweets we mentioned earlier. Many of them express anger and frustration at Trump's response. Some even call him out for hypocrisy, given his own administration's actions.
Those tweets really drive home the point that this isn't just some abstract political debate. This rhetoric is affecting real people, shaping their worldviews and their interactions.
It's like a vicious cycle, right? The more we frame diversity as a problem, the more anxious people get about it, and the more likely they are to support policies that limit it. And that leads to actual harm and injustice.
Exactly. We can't just brush off these anxieties as irrational. They're based on real fears, even if those fears are sometimes rooted in misinformation or prejudice.
So how do we address those fears without dismissing them or giving them more weight than they deserve?
It's a balancing act. We need to acknowledge the validity of those concerns while also challenging the misinformation and stereotypes that feed them.
And we have to do it in a way that doesn't alienate people or make them defensive. It's not about lecturing or telling them they're wrong. It's about engaging in respectful dialogue, listening to each other and finding common ground.
It's about building bridges instead of walls. And that requires a shift in mindset, both individually and as a society. We need to move past these simplistic narratives and do the hard work of building a more just and equitable world.
So instead of getting caught up in this blame game, we need to be asking deeper questions, looking at the root causes of these problems and working together to find solutions. But how do we even begin to do that when everything feels so polarized and divisive?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It can feel overwhelming at times, like we're fighting an uphill battle. But I believe change is possible. It starts with individual actions, with having those tough conversations with family and friends, with challenging misinformation when we see it, and with supporting policies and organizations that promote equity and inclusion.
It sounds like a long and difficult road,
Yeah.
but I guess true change rarely happens overnight.
You're right. It takes time, patience, and a lot of effort. But I believe it's worth it, because a more just and equitable world benefits everyone, not just those who have been marginalized.
The Daily Cost article seems to agree. They argue that this focus on identity politics in times of crisis can actually distract us from dealing with the real problems.
And I think they're onto something. It's like trying to solve a complex equation by focusing on just one variable. You miss the bigger picture and end up with an incomplete or even wrong solution.
We get so fixated on who's to blame that we forget to ask how we can prevent these things from happening again.
Exactly. And that's a tragedy in itself. If we don't learn from our mistakes, we're doomed to repeat them.
So how do we shift gears, from pointing fingers to actually finding solutions?
Yeah.
Especially with something as complex as DEI? It's not like there's a magic bullet.
Absolutely. It's going to require a multifaceted approach, something that addresses the systemic issues and the individual biases that contribute to inequality. We have to tackle both.
Okay, so let's unpack that. When we talk about systemic issues, what does that really mean?
Well, think about it this way. We're talking about the policies, practices, and institutions that create and perpetuate inequality. Things like biased hiring practices, unequal access to education and healthcare, even those unconscious biases that creep into decision-making, it's all connected.
And these things are so deeply rooted in our society, right? It's
Yeah.
not like we can just snap our fingers and make them disappear.
Nope. It's going to take a sustained effort, a real commitment to dismantling these systems and creating a truly level playing field.
And what about those individual biases? How do we tackle those?
That's where education and self-reflection come in. We have to be willing to examine our own beliefs and assumptions, challenge those stereotypes and prejudices that we might not even realize we've absorbed.
So it's about becoming aware of our blind spots and being open to learning from people who have different experiences than our own.
Exactly. And creating a culture of empathy and understanding, a space where people feel safe to share their perspectives and challenge each other's biases in a constructive way.
It sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah,
But I guess that's the price of real change. And if we can move past the blame game, maybe we can start to make some headway on these issues.
I think so. It won't be easy, but it's worth striving for. A society that truly values diversity, equity, and inclusion is a stronger society, a more vibrant society, a more just society for everyone.
As we've been talking, I keep thinking back to that question the Daily Kos article raised. Does focusing on identity politics in times of crisis actually hinder our ability to deal with the real problems?
It's a great question. And I think the answer is it depends. If we use identity politics just to point fingers and assign blame, then yeah, it can definitely be a distraction. But if we use it as a lens to understand the root causes of inequality and to push for systemic change, then it can be a powerful tool for good.
So it's not about ignoring identity politics altogether, but about using it in a way that's productive and focused on finding solutions.
Exactly. We need to move beyond this us versus them mentality and recognize that we're all in this together. We have to build bridges, connect with each other, and work together to create a society that's truly just and equitable for everyone.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive.
Yeah.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but I definitely gained some new insights. What about you?
Absolutely. I always learn something from these conversations.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. The next time you hear about a tragedy or a crisis, try to resist the urge to jump to conclusions or place blame. Instead, ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can I contribute to a more informed, more compassionate, and more constructive dialogue about the real issues?
And remember, change starts with each of us. By challenging our own biases, engaging in respectful conversations, and speaking up for justice and equity, we can build a better world for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable world for all.